Good morning, Learning Associates. This is Dr. Pabon. So we are on Chapter 5 of After the At-Risk Label, and I have a prompt for you all, but I thought it made sense to sort of talk through this prompt a little bit to explain a bit about the text and how this chapter is organized, and then to articulate exactly how I'd like you to imagine your writing about this prompt. So we're thinking of, in two domains right now, right? So we're thinking about, yes, the content of the text and what Dr. Brown means relative to the at-risk label, and in particular, this chapter is focused on practicing teachers and how risk in that category is used to label students. But also, I'm asking you throughout this course to think like doctoral students, right? And read like doctoral students and begin to write like doctoral students, so that you're beginning your transition into the academy in ways that are aligned with the expectations for academic work. So the first thing that I'm thinking about when I start this text, and I'm only looking down because I'm actually looking at the text, so that's one of the things, number one, like text-based analysis, right? So I'm like, always have my book open and always have my text marked up because I'm referring back to the text consistently. And sometimes I remember things off the dome, but most of the time I have to have my text handy and have it marked up just like this, or post-it notes like that. So that I can refer back, and most of my books look like this. So the first question that I'm asking myself as a reader is, how is this text organized? And in the introductory paragraph, Brown lays out the participants, the methodology, the topic, and the findings. So her first sentence is, I discuss how in-service teachers understood, talked about, and acted on the risk and the category and label of the at-risk student. So she's telling you that this is a specific topic that she's focusing on in the chapter that aligns with one of her original research questions. She then goes on to discuss that there are the participants. So there are four in-service teachers who are the participants, and they're in upper elementary grades. And then she says the context is a Midwestern school, which she goes on to explain further in the second section of this chapter, Town, City of Vesputo. She explains also a little bit about her data collection, her methodology, right? The methodology is what you're doing to collect data, right? So the action that you engaged in. So she says that her data set draws from semi-structured interviews. So that means she has 4 participants. She's gotten their permission to conduct these interviews using the IRB process. And creating a question protocol. We don't have access to that protocol in this book. I'm just flipping back to double check that. Yeah, so we don't have the research protocol in terms of the questions that were asked, but she's done her analysis here in this chapter, so we'll learn the findings based on the questions that were asked during these semi-structured interviews. And semi-structured means that there are a set of interview questions, but there are open-ended questions there as well, right? So it gives the participant an opportunity to expound upon what they have to say. And I found in my own research that semi-structured interviews are successful because you never know what the participant is going to say. It provides us with more opportunities for them to extend and expand upon their thinking. Often participants talk in stories, right? Especially those who have much to say. So when you have semi-structured interviews, questions, then it leads to this more data than you would expect to get, and some prizes because you're not setting limits like a yes or no question upon their thinking. So the next section, and this kind of goes, I'm explaining this also because it aligns exactly with our the little chapter that I gave you about reading like a doctoral student, sort of how to read educational research. So the next section is the context. So it talks about the town where Green Mounds Elementary School is located. She gives us some historical information about the indigenous people that live there and the colonial history of the school and sort of what has happened up until now, right? So how it became the case that during her field work that was during the 1990s that the school looked like this. So if you look at the bottom of page 109, there's this interesting little sentence here that says Resputo area schools redrew their district lines so they would receive property taxes from several large retail stores that recently opened in a nearby Lakeville community. So, I mean, here's an example I'm always interested in urban landscapes, right? So this is some redlining here happened, some gerrymandering here happened, right? And I understand how a district would need to expand upon their funding sources, but I think it's important for us to also understand like the context of the schools that we work in and the ways they came to be how they are not by accident, right? There's some specific political decisions that are always being made that set the context for advantages and disadvantages within the institution of public schooling. So she doesn't go into much detail there, it's just this little sentence, but I'm sure there's much more to this story in terms of how these district lines were redrawn. That's not a simple process, so I think that's a bit fascinating. So that is telling us about the outside of the school. Then Brown discusses the inside of the school, so Green Mounds Elementary School, and she tells us how she got into the school. So there's this statement called snowball sampling. So snowball sampling is a process that I also use in my research. I think in the article that I have for you that I've provided, I'm none of the above. I might have said that, but it's definitely in my dissertation. But snowball sampling means this, right? You have your research design, you know who you want to talk to, and you know some people that might know some people who could be good participants. So when I snowball sampled for my study on of Black male teachers in urban schools, I talked to the colleagues that I worked with at one of my former universities, and said, hey, do you know anyone who do you have any students who identify as Black men and who'd be interested in an interview? And those colleagues then got in touch with their students or former students or just teachers and said, hey, I have this colleague who's doing the study. I think you might be interested in being interviewed. Are you interested? And that person said yes. Some people said no. But the people that said yes, the interlocutor put us in touch with one another. So that is really what snowball sampling means. So like a snowball, right? You're sort of setting the stage in motion, setting the snowball in motion, and then you're gathering more participants, right, as you spread the word about the study that you're engaging in. So that is how she gained entry into recruiting teachers for this study. So I think that's important to point out to you as a qualitative interview practice. A couple of other things that I want to point out to you on page 111. We talked about qualitative and quantitative research. Well, page 111 is full of statistical research. So this speaks to the importance of being able to understand that quantitative data, being able to read that quantitative data, because it tells you about the socioeconomic status of the students in the school as well as their academic performance, and that's broken down by race and gender. And particularly, there's some anomalies that are relevant to emerging bilingual students that's discussed at the top of page 113, and then at the bottom of page 113, some anomalies relative to Black students. So here again, Brown is including this data purposefully, because those students are also the ones who are most often labeled at risk, which she's defined earlier in the chapter. And here is this triangulating of the data, right, by providing this quantitative statistical data about their academic performance. So this is leading us up to sort of beginning to understand what the context is, who the students are. Okay, now we need to understand what are the teachers' perspectives, these 4 participants. So this is leading up to what your task is. So for this exercise, for this prompt, what I'd like you to do is choose one of the participants to focus on. That is, and that these are in-service teachers, either Dylan or Zoe or Isabel or Julia, right? And so you'll sort of very briefly discuss what you understood about their perspective, about who they are, what they teach, just some general information about them and their opinions. But the task here is to align the participant, the teacher, with how they talk about risk. So there's 8 categories of talking about risk: engaging in risk discourse, acknowledging at risk as a familiar label for students, recognizing the at-risk student as real and viable category as a person, risk related to family and student characteristics, sliding scale definition of achievement, judging achievement through informal assessments and unspecified grade level expectations, family and student characteristics as key contributors to academic achievement, and the last one, actually, you know what, we're going to stop at 7 because the last one is just the bridging remarks. So there are 7 categories, my apologies. So your job here is to link the participant with the comments in one of those categories or multiple categories. You have your choice of how deep you want to go with this. But I think it's important to identify, and she'll specify who said what. So like I'm looking on page 137, and Zoe recognized that low student self-esteem was an important factor facing students who seem less likely to attain academic success. And then there's a quote that comes directly from Zoe. So I want you to engage in that interpretation of what the particular participant is saying, right, about one of these categories, one or more of these categories. So that is sort of your task, and I'll just sort of articulate it one more time to make sure it's clear. So you're choosing a participant. One paragraph is just sort of explaining like the basic who, what, when, where, how of what you know about that participant. And then the rest of your post should be aligning that participant with those 7 categories, one or more of those 7 categories. So you can have your choice. I'm not looking for a word count here, but at the minimum, choose one of those categories and one that you find interesting. And then in your response to a peer, you have your choice to sort of respond to what they're saying. We've been doing this for a couple weeks now, so I trust that you'll engage in a critical conversation, a critical and courageous conversation that is, and I'll chime in as I hear thoughts being shared that are compelling, or places where I can clarify questions for you all. So I hope that all makes sense. I'm looking forward to your this next discussion board prompt. I think this is going to end up being your last, actually. And have a good rest of the week.